On July 4th, 1961, a submarine was 300 feet deep in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. Within this submarine, something horrifying was unfolding that was completely unknown to the outside world. Inside, men stood outside a door, and the moment they opened it, they knew their prolonged suffering would begin, if not worse. And yet, they had no other choice. This is their horrifying story, and as always, viewer discretion is strongly advised. The Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union was unlike any war the Earth had ever seen. It's generally accepted to have begun somewhere between 1945 and 1947 and would continue for the next nearly half a century. During that period, there were several points where tensions were high enough that they even trickled down to being felt by ordinary citizens. It's hard to really put into words what the atmosphere was like unless you were alive to experience it, at least according to contemporary accounts. Schools literally practiced duck and cover drills, and fallout shelters were encouraged in homes across America. About a decade into the war in the late 1950s, the war was approaching one of its most precarious points. Not only was it the worst arms race in history up until then, but the stakes were simply so high because of the weapons involved. Both countries had several nuclear projects in development that could have horrific consequences if something ever went wrong or if they were ever used. At the time, the US had just launched the USS George Washington, the world's first nuclear missile submarine capable of submerged launches. To keep up with the pace and as a direct response to the severe US threat, the Soviet Navy rushed to create the K-19. This was their own first nuclear-powered ballistic missile submarine and the first of 8 of a kind in what was known as Project 658. Construction began in October of 1957 on the shores of the White Sea, and it was built in a hurry, but the rush caused many problems. The cost and time-saving method caused flaws in both design and construction. The Rubin Design Bureau, which was the most prolific Soviet submarine facility, voiced concerns early on about the cooling system being unreliable, but they were ignored. Speed was clearly prioritized over safety, and they finished building it in just 359 days, which was a new record compared to the 586 days that it took for the American vessel. The K-19 was then launched in October of 1959 and transferred to the outfitting yard. If you're a longtime viewer of the channel, you know that some of these stories can start with almost a comedy of errors, and the K-19 was no exception. During the ceremonial christening, traditionally, a woman is chosen to smash a champagne bottle across the ship's stern, but a man did it instead, which was considered a bad omen. Then the bottle didn't break, which is an even worse sign of bad luck in maritime lore. Instead, it slid along the propellers and bounced off the rubber-coated hull. Further setbacks during the construction caused even more rumors about bad luck, and to many, it seemed as if the K-19 was cursed from the start. It would then have several accidents before it was even commissioned. In January of 1960, during reactor operations, the crew caused an accident that forced them to return to the shipyard for rework. This alone ended up costing 54 million rubles, or around $702,000 to repair the damage as a result. The captain was also demoted 1 rank, and others were reprimanded or replaced entirely. All of this also postponed sea trials, and soon enough, despite the incredible construction speed, they were now behind schedule. And the problems only continued from there. Between May and June of 1960, during maintenance work, workers ran into a very strange phenomenon. They discovered dozens of black, very hard-to-the-touch beetles in the graphite grease on several reactor lid bolts. When one of the mechanics placed some of these beetles in the palm of his hand, they actually moved freely. To determine how these insects could survive in the graphite grease of a reactor that had already been operating for quite a while at full power, they were sent to a specialized research institute, but the shipyard never received any answer. As you might imagine on the sidelines of all of this, many Soviet naval officers felt that the first nuclear submarines, like the K-19, weren't fit for combat, but they kept quiet so they wouldn't get into trouble. And the crews aboard these subs didn't complain either. Almost as if to entice them to do this dangerous job, they got to enjoy a much higher quality standard of food than on other subs like smoked fish, sausages, cheeses, and fine chocolates, which was a step up from what they were used to. Finally, on July 12, 1960, the Soviet flag was raised, and shortly after that, sea trials began. Once again though, almost immediately during the trials, they noticed the rubber hull was peeling and they discovered leaks at 300 meters or 984 feet deep, so the sub had to be repaired again. Despite these many setbacks though, the K-19 officially joined the Northern Fleet on November 12, 1960. For a short time afterward, everything was finally running smoothly until yet another deadly accident happened in 1961. During an operation to load missiles, a sailor was literally crushed by a shaft seal and died. And more accidents just kept happening. All in all, at least 8 workers died due to various incidents such as fires, breathing in toxic fumes, and flooding that nearly sank the submarine several times. But despite clearly being jinxed right from the start, the K-19 still soldiered on. In June of 1961, the K-19 went on its first major training mission codenamed Polar Circle, which was a large-scale Northern Fleet exercise in the North Atlantic. The mission involved breaking through simulated enemy defenses, patrolling under Norwegian sea ice, and positioning for hypothetical strikes. On July 4th, while returning home to base after 16 days of training, the K-19 was at about 100 meters or 328 feet deep, roughly 70 miles from Jan Mayen Island. This island is about midway between Iceland and northern Norway. Both reactors were running at 35% power, the weather was clear, and most of the crew were resting. However, it was during this period that another terrible accident would happen, and this one was about to become one of the biggest catastrophes in naval history. At 4:15 a.m., the alarm went off in the reactor control station. The duty officer then noticed a catastrophic drop in pressure and coolant level in the primary cooling circuit of the starboard reactor. The instrument showed zero pressure, and the cause was a rupture in a thin pressure sensor tube. This tiny tube had apparently been overpressurized during earlier factory tests and had a hidden microcrack. Now it had burst, causing the instruments to falsely show zero pressure while coolant was leaking out and started to jam the circulation pumps. Without coolant flow, the reactor core quickly began overheating. The reactor then shut down automatically, but it was already too late. Temperatures in the reactor climbed toward critical levels, over 400 Celsius or 752 Fahrenheit. And if it kept going, the reactor could have a meltdown or even explode. One of the time and cost-cutting design flaws was that there was no emergency cooling system for the reactor, and the timing made it so much worse. July 4th was US Independence Day. If the reactor exploded, it could release massive radiation into the ocean, and the Americans might misinterpret this as a Soviet nuclear attack, potentially triggering a US response. Captain Nikolai Zadayev then decided to bring the submarine to the surface just 7 minutes later at 4:22 a.m., running on the port reactor. Faced with limited options and fully aware of what was coming, Zadayev actually first considered just ending things, but quickly rejected that idea and instead called an emergency meeting with his officers. He then organized teams of 2 men each. They were ordered to build a makeshift bypass pipeline using whatever spare materials they could find. The idea was to then flood the reactor with cold water to cool it down. However, this was an extremely risky operation requiring entry into the highly radioactive reactor compartment. With no other choice, the teams then entered the reactor room where radiation had reached between 50 and 60 sieverts per hour, far exceeding the lethal threshold of just 4 to 5 sieverts for whole body exposure. To make matters worse, they had almost no protection. Literally just gas masks and thin raincoats, so they worked in short 5 to 10 minute shifts to limit their exposure. The crew then had to improvise a solution in the most dangerous conditions imaginable. They brought in welding equipment and welded pipes from melted wires onto the broken coolant line while having to put out small fires caused by hot electrical cables at the same time. Meanwhile, thick smoke and extreme heat made the work nearly impossible. One early volunteer was 23-year-old Lieutenant Boris Kolchalov, commander of the reactor control group and a favorite of the captain's. He volunteered to lead the first team. The captain then walked into the door to the reactor room and asked him if he understood what he was going into. Kolchalov then replied calmly that he understood. The captain then answered him, quote, "It is hard to send people to their death. Go with God." Just minutes later, Kolchalov came back vomiting, tearing off his gas mask. His face and hands were completely red and had burns and blisters, and he collapsed almost immediately. Over the next few hours, the teams of volunteers rotated into the lethal compartment with basically no protection. All the returning sailors staggered out with red skin, burns and blisters, and vomited immediately. They were dizzy and disoriented and collapsed very quickly after exiting the room. All of them showed clear symptoms of acute radiation syndrome. Despite all of this though, after a couple of failed attempts, the crew had successfully been able to build a rudimentary pipeline and the emergency reactor flushing system was reassembled. They began pumping cold water from the submarine's onboard drinking water tanks into the reactor core, and the temperature dropped from over 400 Celsius down to 330 Celsius, preventing a full meltdown. By 8:45 a.m., they were able to stop the overheating entirely. However, it came at a terrible cost. It caused massive contamination. Gamma radiation spiked 30 to 40 minutes later, spreading into the ventilation system through steam, and there was nowhere to hide from it. Nearly everyone received significant exposure via the contaminated radioactive air. Devices were used to monitor the progression of radioactivity, and the readings rose dramatically. The entire crew of 139 received significant doses and experienced varying degrees of acute radiation syndrome. Worst of all, though, were the 22 volunteers and the repair teams that had absorbed fatal levels. Also known as radiation sickness, acute radiation syndrome occurs after high-dose exposure to ionizing radiation, usually over a short period. And the syndrome progresses in 3 phases. First is the prodromal phase, where the first symptoms show up minutes to hours after exposure. Next is the latent phase, where temporary improvement is seen. And lastly is the manifest illness phase, where the most severe symptoms show up and eventually death. In the first phase, the higher the radiation dose is, the faster the symptoms start to show up, including skin burns, nausea, vomiting, and brain and nervous system problems like severe headache, dizziness, and confusion. This phase began almost immediately for the team, lasted a few hours, and was absolutely brutal. Their skin was turning darker and darker red, and blood spots started appearing on their foreheads and scalps. Severe burns with swelling, blistering, and peeling skin, and faces with eyes completely swollen shut made the victims unrecognizable within 2 hours. Other symptoms showed up like diarrhea, stomach pain, fatigue, sweating, fever, intense pain throughout the body, and yellow foam coming from their mouths. Fluid loss also soon led to dehydration, while nausea and vomiting continued. And vomiting in particular, soon after exposure, is a sign of a very high dose. This amount is almost always fatal, even with intensive hospital care. The second phase, which again is a very brief period where temporary improvement can be seen, can last from a few hours to several weeks, depending on the dose. Higher doses typically result in a shorter latent period. Symptoms like nausea, vomiting, and diarrhea start to go away, giving false hope before the illness continues into the next phase. Some of the victims appeared stable initially and seemed to be improving, but then deteriorated quickly. Others had basically no latent period and went straight into the third and final stage, the manifest illness phase, where the severe illness set in and their whole bodies started shutting down. The medic on board gave what medicine he had, but there were no antidotes for such high radiation. Within hours, they were lying there while their bodies were quickly deteriorating, knowing that death was inevitable. They couldn't speak, so they whispered pleas to their shipmates, begging to be finished so that their suffering would end. As this was going on, Captain Zadaev was going to send a full distress signal, but the long-range antenna had been damaged and prevented full communication. The radio team then used a backup system to send an SOS. The message read, "Reactor instant, personnel heavily irradiated, request assistance." It reached a nearby diesel submarine, the S-270, commanded by Captain 3rd Rank Zon Sverdlov. At 3:30 p.m., Sverdlov boldly violated strict radio silence orders and came to help them, despite knowing about the serious radiation. The S-270 arrived about 12 hours later, and another diesel sub, the S-159, also joined, and evacuations began. Between July 4th and 5th, the entire crew was evacuated. 68 men, including the critically ill, were transferred to the S-270. The severely radioactive crew were then stripped naked on deck, and their contaminated uniforms were thrown overboard. They then shared alcohol to calm their nerves and to help against radiation, which was an old practice. The evacuated crew from the K-19 was then transferred to surface ships and medical teams that arrived after almost 4 days and delivered to Polyarny. This is a large naval town and base on the Kola Peninsula for immediate medical treatment and hospitalization. The unmanned K-19, meanwhile, was also towed to base, and after the incident, it had to undergo 6 months of decontamination. All the contaminated food, clothing, and gear were dumped on an unguarded barge off the peninsula. However, rumors about all the free stuff spread among nearby workers, who looted the cargo, including boots, chocolates, towels, and vodka, and they were likely unaware that they were exposing themselves to radiation. Back in the naval town, despite having appeared to improve at first, the crew's immune systems had been destroyed and their white blood cell counts dropped due to bone marrow damage, causing infections, anemia, and multi-organ failure. Symptoms like nausea, vomiting, diarrhea, abdominal pain, and loss of appetite all came back, together with high fevers. Hair loss happened within days, and skin peeled off in layers, especially on their faces. Some survivors even had to stop shaving afterwards because their skin kept coming off. Because their bone marrow had also been completely destroyed, it also caused low white and red blood cells and low platelets, causing overall bleeding and bruising. Victims also experienced internal hemorrhaging and even sweating blood. Of the 139 men aboard, a total of 42 crew members received dangerous doses. Official classification was 15 with severe radiation sickness, 11 with moderate, and 16 with mild. Treatments like bone marrow transplants can delay death, and Boris Kolchalov and 5 others were flown to Moscow for treatment but died within days. 2 were also sent to Leningrad but died soon after. Kolchalov died on July 10th, and the other 7 died between July 10th and 25th. Their bodies were so radioactive that everything they had touched in the hospitals had to be destroyed, and burials were done secretly at night in zinc coffins in Leningrad and Moscow without notifying any of their family members. A high-level government commission was eventually convened to investigate the accident afterwards. They found serious design flaws in the reactor cooling system and praised the crew's courage. On August 5th, 1961, 26 of the crew members were awarded medals, some posthumously. However, the highest honor, Hero of the Soviet Union, which Captain Zadev requested for the crew, was denied. In total, 22 died from radiation poisoning, 8 within days or weeks, and the other 14 died over 2 years from complications like cancers, infections, and organ failure. Survivors had to go through excruciating treatments like bone marrow transplants and blood transfusions, and had to suffer from health problems for years. Captain Zadev himself spent 18 months in the hospital where doctors replaced both his bone marrow and blood. As if the situation couldn't get any worse, the government wanted to hide the real cause of their illnesses, and medical records were falsified. Survivors were forced to sign 30-year non-disclosure agreements and lied at checkups for decades, and this secrecy prevented proper treatment. Only after the USSR's collapse in the early 1990s did official recognition of the radiation exposure come. When the story became public, the details came out about the victims' prolonged hospital decay and years of agony and drawn-out suffering. Symptoms were documented in survivor interviews, declassified reports, and historical accounts. Captain Zadev also went on to write his memoirs detailing the incident and the aftermath. After the 6-month-long process of decontamination, the K-19 was towed back to base for major reactor compartment replacement and full repair. It was then nicknamed Hiroshima among submariners because of the horrible accident, but returned to service and continued to operate. Incredibly though, its reputation as a curse boat continued. In 1969, it had a collision with the USS Gato, a US nuclear submarine. Then in 1972, there was a major fire in one of the compartments, which led to 30 deaths. In 1982, an electrical accident even killed 1 sailor, but finally, the K-19 was decommissioned for good in 1990. Memorials to honor the victims include one at Kuzminsky Cemetery in Moscow. The monument was unveiled on July 4th, 1998. And still to this day, July 4th is considered to be a traditional day to commemorate the tragedy of the K-19 and to honor the crew's incredible heroism. In 2006, Mikhail Gorbachev nominated the entire crew for the Nobel Peace Prize for preventing a nuclear disaster and potential World War III. He said their actions stopped a disaster that would have been even worse than Chernobyl. To this day, the K-19 disaster remains one of the worst nuclear accidents in submarine history. Because of the accident though, Soviet submarines later got better emergency cooling systems and new safety protocols to prevent this from ever happening again. The heroes who sacrificed their lives to prevent a nuclear explosion and possible global catastrophe will go down in history as some of the bravest men who've ever lived. If you made it this far, thanks so much for watching, and a special thanks to everyone who supports the channel on Patreon or as a channel member. If you're interested, we offer early access videos that are released roughly a week before the regular YouTube uploads. Also, if you have a story suggestion, feel free to submit it using the form found in the description. Anyways, thanks again, and hopefully I will see you in the next one.